Hey, how are you?
It's great to meet you here. And although it's pretty dark in your room, I think it's early in the morning where you are, right?
It is a little bit early in the morning. If I can open the window, but unfortunately, then I will disappear into the sunshine.
Ah, okay,
We
okay,
don't want that, right? So
okay.
we're gonna try to make the colors match. So I put up my funny colors here. So if there's a particular color that you want, I'm able to give it to you.
So great. So after your keynote, we are going to have our beer, but maybe you're going to have a coffee right after your keynote or something else. Here we are. Cool. So the topic of your keynote is, or the title of your keynote is Building and Running Anything with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And you promised to do a real technical keynote, and I've heard that there are 0 slides, right?
0 slides. I have found in my experience that it's more fun when you do your performance without a net. So hopefully there'll be no trouble. I have no demos, I have no slides. What I have is Notepad and my own personal computer, my own development system. So we'll talk about Linux, we'll talk about Windows, we'll talk about Windows 11, we'll talk about Visual Studio Code, how I develop my applications like my website and my podcast that both run in the Azure cloud in Linux, and how they are developed on Windows in both Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. We'll talk about the history of the console and how terminals, shells, and consoles are all different and the same. And we'll talk about the Windows terminal and setting up a nice prompt for yourself. And it'll all be technical, and hopefully you'll get me some great questions and some good interruptions.
That's exactly what we said before we met before the keynote. We really like to encourage all of you, be it here in the room or be it at home following the conference remotely, ask your questions. And right here in the room, my colleague Anna will bring your microphone because we need to make sure that everybody can hear your question, obviously. So if you want to raise a question in the middle of Scott's technical keynote, please raise your hand. Anna will come to you. And I hopefully will get it, and then I will make it possible that you ask your question so that Scott and everybody else can hear it. And if you're following the keynote remotely, please use the chat, and then it's my job to watch the chat and to read questions and to interrupt Scott as soon as there are questions. So we are really looking forward to a lively conversation during your keynote.
That is the goal.
All right.
Crossing my fingers for good luck.
Then I would say, Scott, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, my friends. Appreciate you. Thank you for our friends online and our friends offline. I wish that we could be there. Perhaps next year we'll try again, and I'll see if I can come that side. Now, I happen to be running Windows 11, but most of the things that I'm going to show you will work just fine on Windows 10. We'll be talking about the Windows subsystem for Linux. Most of that works just fine on Windows 10, so don't feel like you have to upgrade to Windows 11 unless you want to. All right, so here's a computer. Here is my main screen. Now, if I go to the Start menu and I type CMD for the command prompt, I end up with this black box that we've all seen before. We've seen this box for many, many years, and sometimes we have thought that this box was DOS. You know, the original DOS operating system. It's actually not DOS. It's the command prompt. It looks like DOS, and it has behaviors like dir for directory and cls for clear. And if I type help, it will give me a list of commands. There's a couple of things going on here, and it's important for us as developers, as technical people, to understand the differences. So, is it a console? Is it a terminal? Is it a shell? What are the differences? I've actually written a blog post talking about the differences between them. These are 3 different words that get used interchangeably. They get mixed up. Another word that gets thrown in a lot is prompt. So we want to break up these different words because they're really all different. The prompt is the thing that you type into, and it provides you with this prompt. It prompts you for input. So a prompt might look like this, or a prompt might look like this, or for your default Linux prompt, it might look like this. The prompt is that moment that says, here's something, start typing. The shell has a bunch of commands that you can type, and it may have a scripting language. The terminal itself does the communications. The terminal itself does the communications, and that word terminal came from the terminal or the terminating end of something. So if two terminals were on the other side of a room or the other side of a wire, they were the terminating end. And you would input here and you would get your output here, or you might plug in tape or punch cards. So it was the terminating end. If you had like doing Morse code and you were going and going, doot, 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 that was like the terminal end of something. So that terminal, that word terminal, came from these original teletypewriters. And then that ends up being called a TTY. And TTY, that concept, sticks with us even now. And if you search for pseudo TTY, you can actually learn all about terminals and pseudo terminals. Pseudo meaning almost a terminal or like a terminal. So even though we are now in 2021, we can still learn about pseudo terminals. These are softwares that emulate terminals, right? It's the device that has the functions of a physical terminal without actually being one. And I think it's really interesting to talk about history in this context because we're here in the 21st century. We're over 1/5 of the way into the 21st century. And we think about things like CRLF in Git. And I was talking to a young person recently, and they were having trouble with CRLF, and they were getting their line endings ruined by an editor. And they didn't remember that Windows uses CRLF for its line ending, and Linux uses different line endings. So for example, if at the DOS prompt here, I just called it the DOS prompt, at the command prompt, the default Windows command prompt, let me go actually on my desktop is here. I'm going to go and I'm going to say copy con, and we'll say abc.txt. So I'm going to do the copy command here, and I'm going to copy from something called con to abc.txt. I hit enter. The file copy didn't occur. That's because con is not a real file. It's a fake file. It's a pseudo file. Con means console. So I'm copying from the console to a file. So I'm going to type abc, and then I'm going to hit Control Z, Control Z, and hit enter. And then I see that the file has been copied. And there is now a file called abc.txt. And interestingly, that has 3 bytes. So I typed ABC, and I have 3 bytes. That makes sense, right? Let's open it up, hit enter. It comes up on my other monitor, and we see ABC. All right, let's try using Visual Studio Code. We'll open up a different text editor here. We see the same thing. Let me zoom in. Now I'm going to go here and I'm going to say show hex dump. And now we see A, B, C. All right. Now, what if we press enter one time? Enter. Save. So I've typed A, B, C, enter. Go look at our command prompt. We do have now 5 bytes, not 4. A, B, C, enter. That's interesting. We can go to the Visual Studio Code editor instead of Notepad. We open that file up and we'll say show hex dump. And suddenly we have A, B, C, 13, 10, 0D, 0A. That's interesting. What's 0D and what's 0A? We go over to our browser and we look for an ASCII chart. ASCII. These are things they don't teach you in school. We look at an old ASCII chart, and we see 10 LF, 13 CR, line feed, carriage return. Carriage return. Let's talk about that. So we have carriage return, and we have line feed. So the young person I was working with said, what's a carriage and where is it returning to? I never thought about that. I mean, I did because I'm old, but they didn't. That's interesting. So let's think about that. Carriage return and line feed. Here's a typewriter. We'll put that piece of paper in there, and then we'll start typing. And you see that the paper is being carried. It is inside of a carriage. And when you're in a carriage, whether it be an airplane or a horse and carriage or a typewriter carriage, you are being carried. So we're being carried, and you notice that the typewriter carriage is moving to the side. And then this bar right here is the carriage return. It returns the carriage. So when the person types, they go bing, they go doot, 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 type, 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 bing, and then they return and line feed. So isn't that interesting? In 2021, CRLF exists in my little text file in order to tell a non-existent typewriter to return its carriage and a non-existent platen to turn and feed the line. That's interesting. However, we'll note our line endings here, CRLF, the default on Windows can be changed to just say line feed, which is the default on Linux. Now, if I click that and hit save, I can see here line feed. We can go back out to the command line and we say dir. Before it was 5 bytes, now it is 4 bytes. That's interesting. Another way to view that is to open it up in an editor like Notepad 2. And I can actually see the line ending. So I've looked at that text file multiple ways. I can look at it from the command line. This is funny. Notice that I typed cat, which means concatenate, which is a Linux command, and it didn't work because I'm not on Linux. We'll be there in a second. So I forgot that my shell supports different commands. And that's a thing that happens as you move from computer to computer. So I'll type abc.txt. You can see ABC. You'll notice that I cannot see the line feed. Okay. Over here in Notepad, in this case, Notepad 2, we can see that the line ending is line feed for the entire text file, and we can see the line ending there, and I can actually change it dynamically. There's only really 2 kinds of line endings right now. There's carriage return line feed, and then there's just line feed. And these are things that affect us as developers when we are moving around on the internet, as we're moving from place to place. I think that's really interesting. I think it's really interesting because it's a piece of history that we don't think about, that from 100 plus years ago, those typewriters are affecting how text moves through our systems. And they are useful things to know as I introduce the idea that I can run Linux on a Windows machine, and I'm going to have to move between formats. If you don't know these things, you may, get in trouble sometimes. For the most part, computers will fix them for you, but knowing that information is super useful. Additionally, it's funny to think that our terminals are being affected by decisions that were made 100 years ago. All right, so we see that our prompt, in this case, the DOS prompt, DOS in quotes, takes commands, and it can do scripting like batch files. And And then the text here, this text that is being processed, all of this text, those strings, there's a division of responsibility. Who is painting the strings versus who is thinking about those strings? For example, I can type a command like dir, and I can pipe it through another command like find, and I can look for a word. So here I have typed a command that creates a string. I have piped it through another command called pipe that takes the result of dir and then, ignoring its case, looks for a string and then returns a file. That's an example of doing something like this in DOS. But the responsibility of passing the strings through, that was done by the shell, by the processor that manages the shell. But whose responsibility was it to paint the pixels? Painting the pixels is a totally different responsibility. Now, if I go and say, let's say dir/s means subdirectories, you're going to see over Zoom how fast it goes. It's going as fast as it can. You're probably seeing it updating somewhat slowly, but on my side, it's a little bit fast. But if I make the window smaller, it will actually be even faster. This is because of historical reasons that this, look how much faster that was. This command prompt here, what we think of as the command prompt, is actually a console called con host. It's the console host. It's the thing that painted the strings. It took the strings from our shell and it painted them on the screen. It picked the font. The command prompt doesn't know or care about fonts. I can change the fonts, but doesn't care. Like the DOS thing doesn't care. Batch files don't care. I can change the colors. It doesn't care. I can do all kinds of things. There's a separation of responsibility. To this example here, when we were over looking at our other terminals, where do we have our terminal there? Here it is. I'll bring that over to here. The person on the other end of this terminal doesn't care what brand of typewriter that we have, what brand of terminal, because there's a standard. All right. So if I open up PowerShell as an example, I'll bring it up on this monitor and I'll pull it over to the next one. So I'm going to open up PowerShell and bring it over here. It's a different color. It's a different prompt. Some of the things work differently. Like I can still type dir, but dir is actually an alias for another command. So it's a different world. But right here, who painted the window? Who drew the fonts? Let's click and say properties. And let's click and say properties. And look at that. It's the same thing. The console host is responsible for that communication. Now, the console host in Windows is very old and it kind of sucks. So the Windows terminal was invented to make these things go away. It's a new, brand new open source terminal that will support any prompt in any world. And I can go like this. Let me pull this down and zoom in. And I can customize this lovely drop-down menu. I've added PowerShell, the command prompt that I just showed you, as well as varying flavors of Linux. So the Linux part we'll talk about in a moment. That's WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux. And then terminal is doing the painting. So now I can do the exact same command prompt. Here it is. I can do like a nice background. I can type dir/s. It's ripping fast as a game, hundreds of frames a second. It's super, super fast. It's written in C++ and it's talking to the screen faster than ever before. It's doing that work asynchronously. I can do things like cool fonts and cool prompts like this. And I can even do things like split screen. So on the left, I have PowerShell, and on the right, I have my Linux. So these are totally different operating systems. And then I can go here I'm going to hold down Alt with my left thumb, and I'm going to click on the command prompt. And now I've got PowerShell in the upper left, Ubuntu on the right, and I've got the command prompt there. I can even hit Alt-Enter and go full screen. Lots of choices, all configurable. My own fonts, my own backgrounds. You can see that the colors are different. It's totally up to me. So that's pretty cool. So the first ingredient to making Windows a great place to live as a developer who likes the command line is the Windows terminal. You can get it from the store, and I've got lots of blog posts on how to update it. You'll notice here that I'm using PowerShell now, so it's a different shell and a different prompt. I've got auto completion. And then when I go to a particular folder here, like this is the source code for my personal website, you can see that it shows the current Git branch, that there's a file that's been added but has not been committed, the current version of .NET, and for no reason, a human heart, because if I make a mistake and I type something, it will turn red, showing me that the previous command was an error, error level 1. That's a really nice experience. And I can move around and see different folders. See, look at this. Different branches, different versions of .NET. That could be Node, that could be Ruby or Go or whatever makes you happy. This is totally separate from the shell. This is the prompt. So in just a moment here, I have changed the terminal to Windows Terminal from conhost. I have plugged in a new shell. I'm using PowerShell. I have a new prompt, and I'm using a prompt called Oh My Posh. And if you go and search for Hanselman Oh My Posh, I actually talk about my ultimate PowerShell prompt, and I walk you through making it. We've even gone and plugged in cool colors and icons. Now, WSL, we'll go back to our desktop here, is the Windows subsystem for Linux. And the Windows subsystem for Linux gives me more choice. So we'll go back to my desktop. I'm going to type WSL -- list. WSL, Windows subsystem for Linux. List everything, and V for verbose. And I'm going to say, look, I've got an Ubuntu version of WSL running. I've got a bunch that are stopped, and I've also got Docker running. So I have 7 different instances of Linux running right now on my Windows machine. And if I go and open up Ubuntu on a separate folder here, a separate tab rather, and of course I could also do a split screen if I wanted to here. And I've got different Ubuntus. I could even have 2 running side by side from each other. So here's Ubuntu 20, and here's Ubuntu 18. I think I made a mistake and my font is, there it is. Okay, now I made the prompt the same. That might be a little bit confusing, but I can prove that it's Ubuntu by running LSB release, and you can see that it's literally Ubuntu 18.04. I can run htop and I can see it. Okay. Now, if we run over to the task manager, WSL is running in a little virtual machine. So it is a real Linux environment, and it is running in what's called a utility virtual machine. It starts up very fast, and I can turn it up and turn it on and off with WSL command line commands. So I can say WSL shutdown or WSL import. I could share my instance of Linux with you by saying WSL export, and I can tar it up or zip it up. A tar file is an archive. And I could say, here's mine, and then you could WSL import it. You can go into the store, the Windows Store, and I could search for Linux. And you can find lots of Linuxes like Kali Linux and Ubuntu and OpenSUSE and run those. So it's totally up to you. You can make your own custom Linux distribution. And if you want, you can even compile your own Linux kernel, because it is the Linux kernel, the real Linux kernel, which is open source, so that you can go and use your own if it makes you happy. Now, right now, if I hit PWD here, I'm in Windows on the C drive. I go to Linux, and I type PWD, print working directory. we are not on the Windows drive, and that can be a little bit confusing. And that speaks to that point I was making before about carriage return and line feed. If you just make assumptions and you move around and you don't think about where you are, you don't think about the files, you might potentially hurt yourself by putting the file in the wrong place or corrupting the file. So I can look at the file system by dumping the file system here, and we can see all the Linuxy stuff. But look down here. Look down here. You see where it says /mnt? That's the mount point for my actual drives. That means my Windows stuff is over here. So if I go mount C, and then remember it was in users, Scott, OneDrive, desktop. Now I'm back over here. So here's my Windows desktop from Linux.
Scott,
now things get a little bit interesting. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just read it. Why has Visual Studio 2022 no remote mode for work within WSL2 like Visual Studio Code?
It does.
That's
a great question. I will open up Visual Studio 2022. My good friend is getting ahead of me here because this is a great question. And I'll open up my podcast website and I'll bring VS 2022 over onto this other monitor. There we go. And then I will come up here to the drop-down menu. And you will notice that Visual Studio 2022 has the option for WSL2, Docker, IIS Express, or Kestrel, which is the ASP.NET Core web server, as well as the snapshot debugger. So there's lots of different choices here. Now, in this case, what this is going to do is it's going to use my C drive, my Windows C drive, to go and work with this code. And it's doing that because Visual Studio's architecture is different than Visual Studio Code. So the question may be the difference between working remotely and working locally. We'll talk about that. So here is a local C drive. It's a Windows app, Windows Visual Studio 2022, talking to C:, GitHub, etc. And here I can go and press F5, and it will actually set up my Linux distribution, and I can debug from VS 2022. And I even have a thing on my blog post where I use Visual Studio and WSL, and I explain step by step how to do remote debugging of apps, including remote debugging of even an app on a Linux browser, which I'll show in just a moment here. That is separate from Visual Studio Code, which I'll show in a moment. So I'm inside of Linux right here, and let's go back to our home. I want to point out that I'm on the Linux file system here, and this is really, really important. If you want native Linux speed, you want to keep WSL on the Linux partition. That is the best way to do it. That's the speed. If I use those mount points, if I go between operating systems, it's going to be slower. So if we go here, and I'll do a git pull, I've just brought down some changes. This is a really great example here where you're on one machine, but you do have to be conscious if you have the code in two places. So here I have the code on the Linux file system here. If I go over to the Windows side, and we'll go and find that code, and I'll say git pull as well. That's already up to date. That's in C GitHub, but I can move seamlessly between the two. And that's why I put that logo down in the corner so I can remember where I'm at. So from here, I can say .NET build, go and build that application on Linux. I can go and then say .NET run. I'm on Linux on Windows, and you'll notice it's working quite fast. And then I can click on the link there. See how it underlines, and now I'm running it locally here. Now this is really cool. See how it says local host? It's actually a different computer. It's a different computer because it's running as a little tiny virtual machine, even though it's a fast virtual machine. And they are port forwarding those. So they're automatically making sure that localhost feels like localhost, which is really nice. All right. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. If I said code dot, I'm going to go ahead and close Visual Studio Code to make sure that it's clear, and I hit enter. Look, look, look. Installing VS Code Server. VS Code is split in half, and it's installed half of itself in Linux while launching the Windows version of Visual Studio Code. And in the lower corner here, you see it knows it's talking to WSL. So Visual Studio Code has become a client-server application. And if I go to the File menu and I say Open File, that is the Linux file system. And if we open up one of these files, actually, let's do this. Let's go here and we'll open up some code. There we go. I want to just call back to the line feed, which is the Linux line feed. So Notepad, Visual Studio Code are all smart and able to move us back and forth between these things. Now, if we go back over to Windows, though, okay, and let's go and open up one of those files on the Windows side. I'll open it up in Notepad. Bring it over here. See how it says Windows CRLF? That's because Git is managing the carriage return and the line feeds for me. I don't have to think about it, but it's kind of cool to know that that's being handled by the CRLF automatic check-in for Git. And that's another reason why you want to have your code in Windows Subsystem for Linux on the Linux file system if you can. So now, at this point, I'm on a Windows Visual Studio Code instance talking to the Linux file system, okay? And then I can even open a terminal inside of VS Code. We can stop that one, come back here, and I'll say .NET Run from within the terminal inside of VS Code. I can run that, and here we are again. And this is an interesting thing. Let's just take a moment and look at, let's just pause here and look at this. We got a couple things going here. We have Visual Studio Code in Windows looking at the Linux file system. That's interesting. We are reminded of it by that lower left-hand corner area. We can see our Git branch right now is main. We have a terminal open, but it's not the command prompt from default Windows. It's not Windows Terminal. It's a terminal that is built into Visual Studio Code. Does that mean it's not PowerShell? Does that mean it's not really my prompt? No, it doesn't mean anything. It means that you can mix and match your terminals, your prompts, and your shells comfortably. See? Bash, PowerShell, Tmux, whatever. There's a terminal built into Visual Studio Code that looks a lot like this one because I have lined up the fonts, I've lined up the prompts, and that makes my environment really comfortable and really joyful to work in. So there's Visual Studio Code talking to WSL2, and then here's Visual Studio proper. I use the same theme, and I have the ability to also debug from WSL2. The only difference is that this code is on the Windows side, and then we map a drive over for Linux, while this is being edited directly on the Linux file system. That's a lot of information, I realize. But when you understand the historical context of it, it becomes really, really interesting. Additionally, if we go and remind ourselves where we are, we're on the Linux file system. If I type explorer.exe, which is a Windows executable, and then I press dot, so I'm going to say, hey, explorer.exe, here's the current folder. Look, now I am in the Windows Explorer looking at the Linux file system. How? Via a network share, a local host network share. So that means I can take any application even one that doesn't know about WSL. For example, I can take Notepad 2. Where's my Notepad 2? I think it's on another screen. I've got all these screens and I'm hunting for my apps. Is it over here? Yeah, there it is. So here's a app that doesn't know about Linux, and I'm going to just pull a file over and drop it. It opens it up because we made Ubuntu look like a network share. We can see the line feeds, and I can safely edit this file here because it's happening over a network share. Hopefully people are quiet because they find this interesting and their brains are exploding. Here's the cool part. Docker is being managed in this context from WSL. So if I type WSL list, you can see that Docker is running. And you notice that they're running in their own kind of hidden little WSL instances. The same thing applies to graphical apps. Watch this. I'm in the Windows Start menu, and there's icons here with a little Linux tuxedo guy next to them. They've automatically appeared. So I'm going to run the one that's called the GIMP, and I'll run Emacs. That is a real Linux app launched from the Windows Start menu, running at full speed within the context of WSL. Isn't that cool? What they're doing is they're remote desktopping into Linux and then painting that application as if it were any app. And it's full high quality, it's full speed. When I open it up, I get the dialog box that I would expect to get. Control scroll works on my mouse. It looks great. I've got Emacs, I've got whatever app I want. And if I install a Linux app, like a Linux browser even, I can do it at the command line with apt-get install, and it automatically gets an icon as well. And down here in the start menu, in the taskbar rather, they get a little tuxedo. So you can be in Visual Studio on Windows, configure a launch target, and write a Linux app in C++ or in whatever and test it. So this has allowed me to have my applications, like my podcast and my blog, get developed on very comfortably here. I can then run them on Linux. And then when I put them up into the cloud, let's go over here. When I put them up into the cloud, they run just right because, I'm in the wrong folder, sorry. When they run in the cloud, I'm guaranteed that they're going to run well because I've already tested them on Linux. And I've even got PowerShell scripts here to build them as Docker files. So I can run them in Windows, I can run them in Linux, and I can run them in Docker, all on the same Windows machine. If it's a Linux graphical app, I can run it as a graphical app, and I'll know that they'll work in the cloud. So it feels like Linux on the desktop is happening. It's just happening on the Windows desktop, which is kind of awesome. Any questions? There's not been a lot of questions, my friend, so I assume that means people are enjoying themselves or they've all left because I can't see you.
Yeah, please feel invited to add something to our... here's a question. Anna, 1 second. One second.
Yay, a question.
Here we are. Yes.
This is working. Hello? Yeah, it's working.
Hi.
Hi, Scott. Hope you're doing well. I've got 2 questions for you. One question would be if there's any way to change the default Windows return to be a line feed?
It depends. So that's a great question. So the question is, can you teach Windows to make things a line feed? It's not Windows' fault. It's the apps that are using Windows. So for example, if we open Notepad by itself, Notepad right here is defaulting to Windows CRLF. So if we wanted to fix that, we would have to tell the Notepad team to do that. That's not currently possible because Notepad's on 1 billion machines and we'd break it for 1 billion people. But you could do that for something like Notepad 2 or Visual Studio Code. And then if you set your default in Visual Studio Code or Notepad 2 or Notepad++ or whatever your text editor is, then your text editor would only ever make line feeds, and then you wouldn't have that problem. So the problem is in Windows. It's the apps on Windows that assume the default. And I think that with the improvements that we've seen in Notepad, at least becoming smart, I just double click on that, or Visual Studio Code, which of course works great and doesn't think about line feeds, then you just need to set all of your defaults. But if you look what I did, the automatic auto CRLF choices in Git will hide most of that from you. Good question, but it's not an operating system setting. It is a convention. It's a standard that is de facto. Good question. Thank you for that.
Cool. Thanks. Another question is regarding Windows Terminal. Is there actually any easy way to provide parameter auto-completion directly from C# code when you write a console application?
Autocomplete from a console app.
Yeah, if you have like parameters for your console app and you define them in your code, like I don't know if you are familiar with Python scripting, where you have the header where you can define parameters you have with possible values even.
Yeah. So if I go out to here and I type, let's try this. I'm guessing. This is good when we have questions that I was not planning for. I'm going to be here and I'm going to type in .NET B, and I'm going to hit tab. And you see how it auto-completed build? Okay. That's happening because there's actually a hidden command within the .NET command line called autocomplete. And if we look at my PowerShell profile, which is right here, PowerShell includes a thing that are called argument completers. And you can register argument completers for any application that you want. So for example, when I typed .NET build, it actually then automatically types .NET complete for me. So I typed in .NET B, right? What it actually did was it said, let's go ahead and clear this out. It said .NET complete B. .NET then returned a list of options. So I type .NET B dash, and then I get these choices. See how I'm going tab, tab, tab? And that's going through this list of 4 options. If you write a command line app and then give it a command by which it can then take a piece of text and return a list of options, argument completers will automatically do that. So if you have an app like Docker and you just hit tab and it'll autocomplete, all you have to do is follow the rules of an argument completer and that will work. So I've done argument completers for like winget, which is like apt-get for Windows. So if I type winget I, now I'm getting a list of things that I could potentially install. So that argument completer is, in this case, built into both winget and .NET. You'll notice that the convention is whatever complete. And then in this case, winget's doing it differently. They have -- position, which then includes the cursor position. And then .NET takes the word to complete in quotes. And then winget takes that word and puts it in like this. Doesn't really matter, but the result then gets returned as a completion result. And if you do that, yes, you can take any command line tool, any tool that you have at work, and turn it into an auto-completed application. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Here's another question.
Stressful.
Let me please read it from the chat. Debugging Android and iOS with WSL2 would be cool. What is the long-term vision for that?
It would be cool, but Android development works in the Android emulator, which runs in its own world. So you're talking about an emulator within an emulator. We already have great Press F5 run an Android emulator support in Visual Studio already. So rather than thinking about the architecture of whether Android runs in WSL or whether Android runs here or runs there, the goal is always going to be any application, press F5, and be able to debug it, whether it be in Docker or in Android or in Linux or WSL or whatever you want to be able to do. So I don't know if that'll run in the context of WSL or not, but that's the idea. So yes, being able to hit F5 and just have it work. And then additionally, and you'll hear about this more at the Visual Studio launch, that idea of hot reload, being able to not only press F5 and do something, but then make changes to your code and not have to shut it down and start it up again. So I want to be able to run my app, keep it running, make changes to the code, make changes to the markup, to the XAML, to whatever, and have that app be updating in real time. Again, regardless of the architecture, that is the goal. The inner loop, the like write code, hit refresh, write code, hit refresh, we want to remove the hit refresh part and just make it so it's like just write code and it's just the app is always updating.
One more question. Would you consider editor config a viable alternative to Git auto CRLF, and why not?
Oh, interesting. Okay. So the person is making the comment that there's a thing called editor config, and editor config looks like this. So this is my editor config. It's what's called a dot file, dot because it has a dot in front of it. And an editor config is basically an INI file with a description of how I want my code written. And it's usually checked in and shared with teams so that people have style guides that are set up for everyone. The style guides speak to like what style of .NET am I going to write, or how do I want my node done, or I only want constants done as Pascal case, right? It's a conventions file, okay? Do you want new lines before an open brace? Editor config controls whether or not we get squigglies when we do stuff. So if I put something over here and I want to check it in and I don't like it, will it be marked as a problem? Will it be marked as something we don't want to do? Those are code conventions, though. Those are not how the file is actually saved on disk. The CRLF, the whether or not the disk, the file on disk will include a carriage return, that's a Git storage issue. It's not the semantics of the code. It's a storage issue. So no, editor config is not a replacement for an understanding of CRLF. Let Git manage that. It doesn't matter what the person locally, Linux, Windows, or whatever, is using. Right now, I'm using CRLF. I literally haven't even thought about it. It's just not a thing I need to worry about. Because when I check it in, it's going to be stored in Git as LF automatically. So when I return it, when I pull it out of Git, they're adding the carriage returns. When I push it back in, they're removing the carriage returns. To the point of the previous question or two questions ago, it should just be LF by default. But if you use auto CRLF on its own correctly, this is higher level semantics. You can, if you want, set end of line. In this case, I've done it for shell scripts, which get confused when they're not done another way. But Git doesn't look at editor config. Git doesn't use this as an enforcer. Git is its own carriage return line feed enforcer. And because Git doesn't look at editor config, you could still sneak the wrong files in. So no, I don't think that's a replacement. It's a good tool, but it's not a replacement. What good questions our friends have today. Good stuff, people.
Here's another one. If you were to migrate away from Docker Desktop for Windows, what setup would you recommend?
That is a good question. We are all looking at that option right now, and there is a tool. It was called, I forgot the name of it. There is discussion about this. It was called, so the short answer is you can just install Docker without it. It's fine. Like you can just go and install it. Podman, that's it. So you can go to the command prompt, run Linux, install Docker, but you have to manage it all. The value of Docker Desktop is a lot of networking and management is done for you. So if I bring Docker Desktop over onto the screen here, it handles volume mapping very cleanly. You don't have to worry about command lines. I can see all of my existing images. It's a great UI and management system on top of stuff. I've got Kubernetes running locally. So it's a convenience. Doesn't mean you can't just run Docker. You don't need it. You can run Docker. But there is this thing called Podman. And Jonathan here has written about Podman and WSL. I think in the next 6 months, we'll see more and more people coming up with solutions because the architecture is supportive of anything. You can do anything you want. So as we saw before, I have Docker running in its own instance, and that's something that is managed by the Docker Desktop. But that doesn't mean that another instance can't come and use containers without Docker. So I'm not too worried about it. I use Docker Desktop for personal use, but for big companies that want to get away from it, I think Podman is probably in the short term a decent solution, but we'll have to figure out what a long-term solution is in the future.
Cool.
Good stuff.
One more question here. Is there an easy way to provide parameter auto-completion to Windows Terminal from a C# console application source?
That was the question that we just did before.
Oh, sorry.
Register argument completion.
Then I read it twice. Sorry for that. Okay, then it was. That's what was it?
Cool. I'm just going to start shutting things down here. Any other questions, my friends? Do they look like they're happy? Is the audience smiling?
Yes, I think everybody's fine. Some more questions. Good. Last chance. And also in the chat. Last question before we go.
Well, okay, what do you got?
To a beer. No, I think that's it.
All right, my friends. I want to encourage you, if you enjoyed this talk, you can find more information at my YouTube channel. I've got a whole section called Computer Stuff They Didn't Teach You in School. And I talk about carriage returns and encoding and hotkeys and Git. I'm very proud of this Git 101 video. It'll teach you Git. And I've got all kinds of stuff. And I even put up recently a Learn C# class. So check out my YouTube and check out my podcast. I've got over 800 episodes of cool people talking about cool technology. So if you like this talk, there's more of me on the internet.
Cool. Lots of applause in the chat. And I think here's also a big applause in the hall. Give him a hand, please. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for so many questions. And Scott, it was great to meet you, at least digitally or virtually. And I hope to see you soon at one of the future Buster conferences again, right here in Mainz. That would be great.
That would be great. I'll see you soon.
Cool. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day. And for all of you, have a good evening. Now we are having an expo reception here. So we serve a little beer and also soft drinks, something to eat here. And as we are pretty late, I would say we postpone the last session, async streaming with Christian Nagel, by 15 minutes. Yeah? So we do it 15 minutes later so that you have enough time to relax and to chat right here in the expo hall. Thank you very much. Scott, it was great to meet you. See you.